You're gonna need a bigger boat. So serious.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for September 20th, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Thanks for joining us this week, everybody. This is sure to be one heck of a blood-sucking show.
And for the rest of this episode, we will be referring to ourselves as El Brende and El JDA.
Exactly. That's exactly how this is going to go.
Yep.
As we talk about Pablo Larraín's new film, El Conde, which is a movie that I knew was coming out this year. I believe it was mentioned all the way back in January when we did our yearly preview show.
Yeah.
So knew this was coming out. Wasn't exactly sure what it was going to be. And then
I don't think anyone knew what it was going to be, and they didn't know it was going to be what it actually ended up being, right?
Exactly. I think it was both of those things. Wasn't sure what it was going to be, and then as the film premiered, people saw it.
And it's like, well, I didn't expect that. Whatever it ended up being.
I think everyone was a little bit surprised.
Yeah.
Which we'll get into for better or worse. Before we do, Brendan, a little bit of context. How do you feel about one Pablo Larraín?
Oh man, you're stealing my thunder because that's how I was going to open my thoughts.
Okay,
for this
well,
film.
we can hold on.
Well, actually, no.
It's
Let's talk about Pablo Larraín because I do think it is something I wanted to talk about first. So because this is the question you're posing, let's start with that.
Before you go on, though, I think we can keep it. I think for the sake of the fun of the conversation. We don't have to talk about Pablo Larraín and what El Conde is.
No, we don't have to talk about what he's
in terms
doing
of
with El Conde.
his filmography.
Yeah.
Just prior to this, what we thought of him.
Well, I'll just simply say this: El Conde is further proof of my feelings toward Pablo Larraín. You know, we love a lot of directors for certain reasons, right? And most of those reasons, in a very superficial and high level way. It's because they have certain characteristics, aesthetic traits, whatever they may be, that we latch on to and that we really like. Like you see a group of Spielberg films, you can tell they were directed by Spielberg, right? It's like that whole auteur theory thing. Pablo Larraín is a director I still cannot pin down. I cannot pin this guy down. Like you put Spencer, Jackie, and Emma, whatever it was called.
Yeah.
If you put all of those next to each other, they might as well have been directed by 4 different people. Like it's so inconsistent, but I think that's what makes him so exciting. And not all of his films work, but he never plays the same game twice. I mean, maybe he kind of does with Spencer and Jackie. Like they almost feel like companion pieces in a certain way, but even so, there are still very glaring differences between them. But that's what I find really exciting about his work. And there are aspects of his films I like more than others. But yeah, that I can't pin the guy down. I can't pin him down. That's what's so fascinating.
But I love it. Whatever he's doing.
I never know what I'm going to get. It's always surprising.
I never know what I'm going to get, but I love it.
His films are a box of chocolates.
Absolutely. I hope he keeps drinking the same creative blood as his vampires do. Because, my God, I really like his films. Of those that I've seen, I really like, especially Jackie, Emma, Spencer. Those 3, I think, are some of the best work of their respective years.
I haven't seen Neruda, but I hear that one's pretty good too.
I did see that one. Jackie, well, and it's interesting because I caught up with Neruda during award season after I had seen Jackie, which ended up being one of my very favorite movies of that year. So that film was always destined, I think, to be a lesser Larraín film. Maybe I should go back and revisit that film in a different context and see how it holds up for me. But it's a film I do like, but it is a little more uneven for me comparatively to Jackie Emma and Spencer. But
Yeah.
that is to say, still a filmmaker that I am entranced by. And I'm always curious to see what he has up his sleeves next, especially after this one, especially after El Conde.
Yeah.
I think with that, we can go ahead and get into it. It is, of course, directed by Pablo Larraín.
Yeah.
It stars Jaime Vidal, Gloria Munchmeyer, Alfredo Castro, Paulo Lunsinger, and many others that come and go throughout the film. If you're not familiar with El Conde, it centers on Augusto Pinochet, who is not dead, but instead an aged vampire. After living 250 years in this world, he has decided to die once and for all. All right.
I love the way you do plot synopses
Thank you.
nowadays. Like you act them out. It's like a form of
Yes.
theater.
I'm channeling my own theater. So,
Your own count.
my own count. Yeah.
JD the Count over here. I love it.
All right. So with all of that said, Brendan, what did you think about El Conde?
And it's interesting, this isn't the first time that Pablo Larraín has made a movie that was at least indirectly about Augusto Pinochet, right? Because the film No was around the person in some ways, right?
Yes.
Yes. The only difference is El Conde really isn't a historical film. I mean, there are elements of fact and history here, and then there are many elements that are not. So he's clearly taking a lot of liberties, especially when it's introduced that a very young Pinochet actually had a somewhat of a relationship with Marie Antoinette. So there is definitely a little fabrication happening here.
A little bit.
This is a comedy. This is a comedy.
Yes.
So it's that with that plot synopsis there that you laid out, it should be known that this is meant to be very tongue in cheek. The style here is very much mirroring those like classic horror movies from the 1920s. It's very Nosferatu as an example. So it's definitely channeling something that I don't think we've ever really seen Pablo Larraín do. Man, this is going to be one of those reviews where I think I might solidify my thoughts mid-conversation. There are some films where you go into it kind of like halfway there, whether you really like it or not. And I'm kind of there with this one. There are elements of it I love, but I think I'm also kind of frustrated by it. It's a film that I think is more devoted to pastiche than it is story. I feel like my instinct right now is telling me I think this feels like a short film that was milked out to be a feature length. And that's, again, maybe you'll have a certain perspective and you'll have an argument as to the progression and the trajectory of this movie that might allow me to see something a bit more cinematic here. But I love the first third of this movie. I love the way it's introduced. I love the voiceover narration, and the way that narration is actually revealed at the end, I think is somewhat clever in its own way.
Sure.
I think it's one of those movies that kind of milks its clever concept more than it perhaps needed to. And I think it offers up a lot of what it needs to say in the first half and doesn't go much beyond that. And I think that's unfortunate because I like a lot of what it's doing. The real star of this movie for me is Edward Lockman's cinematography. This is a gorgeous movie. It's a gorgeous movie. It's one of the best shot films of the entire year. And just from an aesthetic standpoint, I kind of want people to check it out, even if it's gonna be a movie they end up hating, just to at least appreciate the visual artistry at play here. And then there are even some flying sequences here that I think are quite inspired. One towards the end where the musicality couples with it, that it's actually quite tender and beautiful in its own twisted and comedic
like a ballet
way.
almost.
It very much is. And I kind of went with it, but it got to a point where I started to think, man, I wish this just became kind of this vibey silent film after getting all of its narrative and themes out of the way in the first half. And I think it just starts to spin its wheels narratively and thematically quite a bit by the end. So I think it overtells itself, but I appreciate a lot of what it's going for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I do think this film is really funny and darkly entertaining.
Okay.
This is quite a very different turn for Lorraine. I, as I noted, loved Spencer, Jackie, and Emma, and mostly like Neruda. And while this film maintains that same level of craftsmanship as his other films, tonally, this is so wildly distinct.
Yeah.
I know he's dabbled into this world before. You mentioned it earlier regarding Augusto Pinochet, specifically with Postmortem, and know a little bit. But I haven't seen those films, so I can't speak to them. Although, by all accounts, those are drama films. El Conde is acting as a brazen satirical dark comedy. And the way it ridicules political crimes and violence, I think, is pretty diverting. There's something about channeling these figures as blood-sucking evil vampires that may be obvious comedically, but the symbolism is proficient. And there's a dry quality to much of it that subtly gives bite, pun intended, to its satire. The dialogue is maybe less so at times, but the film's premise and visuals mostly rely on its droll absurdity to give it weight. For example, and I love that Brennan set this up beautifully, there's that moment early on when Augusto witnesses the beheading of Marie Antoinette. And afterwards, we simply get a shot of him licking the blood off the guillotine and digging up her grave to steal her sliced head.
I love that. That's great.
I do too. It's very weird, but darkly comical and wholly reliant on the visual to deliver that levity. And the cinematography here is remarkably exquisite. The images in this film are radiant, and its black and white aesthetic, I think, is not only lush, but it complements the film's themes very well. We'll certainly get into it as we go here. I do think its indignancy and righteous anger is artfully rendered, often very gratifying. But I'm with you. I do think the screenplay is uneven and perhaps a missed opportunity. I certainly want to get into that. But on the whole, I did very much enjoy, if for nothing else, the dark humor and the images of this film, which are just dazzling.
And there are even some very simple and blink and you miss it images here that are some of the funniest things I've seen all year, but they don't call attention to themselves. There's one where we see Pinochet himself, an elderly Pinochet. I think this is maybe at around the halfway point, where he's on a treadmill and he's wearing Nike shoes. like just like a little gag like that. I think what makes it funny is that it's not presenting itself as a gag. And that's where I think that's where I think some of the if you want to call it satire, that's where I think it's at its strongest. This is really more farcical than it is satirical.
But that's why I called it dry. Like it's more dry than it is trying to be like A Big Short or Don't Look Up or something that's trying to be a little bit more outlandish. This is wildly satirical for sure, but it doesn't present itself in that same way. Like you talked about, like, or even with the Marie Antoinette, like the film just simply shows us him licking the thing. Like it's on its own terms. There's really nothing much beyond that. It's just the idea of what's happening and how the film is commenting on that through that absurdity that makes it so entertaining, but it's not presenting itself as anything beyond that.
Well,
if that makes sense.
It does make sense. And it's why I think the film relying a bit more on that visual absurdity would have actually done it some good. I think where the film starts to lose me is when it starts to get a little bit more suffocated by its not political dealings, but more of its financial dealings when the kids get involved. And I think I get what it's going for, to show almost like this hereditary like passing down of greed and lust for power, and how that still falls within the realm of your children because you represented that as history. It's very much presenting this right-wing semi-fascist mentality that exists across all bloodlines. So I get that maybe that's what it's going for, but man, it spins those wheels a lot, and it really just becomes there more for plot than it does purpose. And that's where I felt like it was really starting to spin those wheels too much. And I would have preferred much of that or at least a lot more of that visual absurdity that you're talking
Yeah, that's
about.
understandable.
And I think that's where the film is at its strongest.
No, I don't disagree. I think what you're getting into as far as the film being heavy on premise and
Hmm.
less so on fully realizing that through its visual commentary.
Hmm.
And I think that's where I'm a little bit twofold with this film, especially when it comes to Pinochet himself,
Yeah.
because this is a character that is at once compelling to me, but I also feel like it's a missed opportunity because this is a man who is reviled for his atrocities.
Yeah.
Which makes sense why Lorraine keeps going back to him in his films. There is
Yeah.
a lot to wrestle with given his dictatorship and horror.
Hmm.
But this is a film that doesn't really want to wrestle with that specifically, at least not directly. Instead, Pinochet, as we noted, is this 250-year-old vampire
Yeah.
who is loathing his existence and
Yeah.
yearning to be dead. We mostly see him moping around, getting on a treadmill, attempting to remove himself from the drama
Yeah.
of his kids discussing their inheritance money or his wife nagging him about their future together. Now, some of the film's greatest humor comes from the lack of respect that is shown to him,
Yeah.
but his apathy toward life is more of a trait than it is a nuanced feature. There isn't much substance to him, and with how he's grappling with his immortality. However, there is something about how starkly dense he is that I do think adds to the film's satire, and it
Yeah.
appears that's mostly what Lorraine was going for here, especially given this third act reveal that we get, which is incredibly hysterical, and given and to me it gives the film even more heft to the idea that Pinochet is essentially a child, not
Oh,
one
yeah.
that
Okay.
is
I was wondering
innocent,
what reveal
but
you're talking about, but yeah, the reveal of who the voiceover narrator actually
yes,
is.
that's it. Like that reveal, I think, is really funny. Again, it gives heft to the idea that Pinochet is essentially this child, not an innocent one, but one that is obtuse and daft.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that makes for the strongest commentary. I did laugh at it thanks to the performance by Jaime Vidal and again
Yeah.
how Lorraine demonstrates his vacuousness visually. But this is a dictator whose crimes against humanity are among the very worst. So yes, a blood-sucking evil vampire is apt. I just
Yeah,
wonder if there's a better way to satirize him by including his atrocities or at least tackling it more directly. I'm not
Well,
sure it's just a thought, but I do think there's a possible missed opportunity here to do something more complex than what's here. But I did find the
yeah.
humor around him effective.
I mostly did as well, and again, it's when it was relying on those visuals that we keep talking about. I think it gets constantly distracted by. It's funny when I keep saying that the film is more heavy on premise than it is story. By the time it starts to introduce more of a story, that's when it starts to lose me. Ironically, it's
Well, and that's the irony.
yeah, and I guess I wish the film was a bit more weirdly reliant on its obvious central metaphor. Your metaphor in any movie, it could be as obvious as it needs to be, or it
that's
doesn't
not
need
my
to be
issue
subtle.
here. Yeah.
You could still make that entertaining. And I think this film does a fair job, at least for the most part, making that very obvious central metaphor at least compelling to watch, because there are some great gags to emulate that, especially that final reveal of who the voiceover narrator actually is. I gotta admit, I was a little confused by that, because watching it on Netflix, I sometimes like to watch with subtitles, but every time I put the subtitles on, it would change all of the dialogue to English, even though it's not all in. And so it was kind of weird to watch in that way. But by the time it got to the end, it sort of answered my own confusion as to, so
I love that sleight of hand.
Oh, it's like, okay, this voiceover narrator is speaking in English because they are actually, okay. Okay. But I think there was a way to still arrive at that specific conclusion without getting bogged down in the finances or the incorporation of this nun/accountant, which I kind of like the idea of a character like that, sort of pulling Pinochet back to this desire to live, this lust for life, this lust for killing in some ways, as if that's never left him. But man, it spins those wheels a lot in order
Yeah.
to get to that.
Well, I think this is where the film, and I do want to try to talk about the film for what it is and not what I think it should be.
Yeah.
I do want to be careful to not get too much down this rabbit hole. However, I do think there is a missed opportunity here because I do, when you're talking about his children and the film getting bogged down in the story, the irony that it's heavy on premise, but uneven in its story. And it's, even though we want story, when the film does give us that, that's when this film is at its weakest.
Yeah.
And I think the interesting irony in that, or perhaps, because I can understand where Larraín is coming from in terms of the film's ideas on humiliation. Because again, the atrocities of this man and his family were so egregious that Larraín wants to go out of his way to humiliate him artistically here.
Yeah.
And we do see that in some pretty exquisite ways, I think, at least on paper, right? Because this is a man who is not ashamed of his atrocities as we see him depicted here. Or the violence he's caused.
In fact, he deliberately comes out and says,
talks about it.
But what he gets ashamed by is when people call him a thief, not a murderer, a thief. That's what he's more ashamed by.
Exactly. Him and Fyodor, his butler, they talk about it openly. Fyodor also being a vampire. I think we can give that away.
Yeah, that's
They
fair.
talk about this openly, that they are almost proud of the atrocities. They're proud of the carnage and the bodies they've left behind. And the irony is, the one thing he's embarrassed by, or embarrassed about his legacy, is that it's tarnished because of financial irresponsibility, that people call him a thief. He's humiliated because he had to fake his own death as a result of all of that. And now his kids are fighting over all of this scattered wealth that is all over the world and hidden in all these various ways. And that's brought on embarrassment. He's not embarrassed or ashamed of anything, just the scattered money all over the place. So like in terms of humiliation and wanting to humiliate the family, I understand what Larraín was wanting to go for there. And then you inject that with the Carmen character, who is there for a dual purpose.
Yeah.
And one of those purposes has to do with her being a nun and being a part of the church. And she's, she flat out says at one point, "I'm here to humiliate the devil."
Yeah.
In other words, humiliate Pinochet himself. And I do want to talk about this film as it relates to the church and the state, because I think there's some interesting ideas this film has in that regard as well. But at the same time, as much as I find the film's ideas on humiliation interesting on their own terms in a vacuum, as much as I like what the film is doing in terms of, the film's commentary on the church and the state and fascism and how those things are maybe more tethered than what they seem to be on the surface.
Right.
That, again, in a vacuum is interesting. My question is, at least as it relates to this film, not in real life, what does Pinochet have to do with any of that? That's absent from all of it.
Well, see, narratively speaking, he's not only absent from all of that, but I mean, I get why his finances have to play a part in that story in order to emphasize that humiliation that you're talking about, but it goes about it in a way that almost feels like a mystery film, that you have to pay attention to starts talking about how many accounts did he have in Panama? How many accounts does he have in the United States? Oh, do you know that the IRS is cracking down on this? Because
I was waiting for Kenneth Branagh to show up. I was waiting for Perot to show up with his mustache.
But it's like, it treats it like too much plot.
Yeah,
and
it is.
That's the problem. It's the way it treats it and maneuvers around it.
I completely agree. I think the film gets bogged down in wanting to humiliate this family because of their financial irresponsibilities and how that offers some irony, again, as he's not ashamed. And then there's Carmen, as we noted, this nun in the Catholic Church. And, she makes it vividly clear why she's there from the moment we first meet her as she's introduced. But as the film unfolds, it's pretty incredible how Lorraine attempts to murky the waters between the church and the state, and how the church wanted to essentially purify the legacy of Pinochet. There's a fascinating dichotomy given the dramatic tension between Carmen and Pinochet, because at once it goes on to demonstrate the naivete of Pinochet, again, his vacuousness with how she was able to manipulate him so easily. But at the same time, Lorraine murkies the waters as far as the church's motives. So despite how mixed I am on Pinochet, I do love, again, how provocative that is. But the problem is the film is at its best when we see Pinochet on screen directly and he's being undermined. Yeah, he's reacting to these things. Or it's these subtle visual gags, as we mentioned earlier. When the film is undermining him directly, that's where this film is at its best. And especially given the visuals of this film, as we mentioned earlier, and not just how lush they are, but how they help evoke that satire.
Well, yeah.
In this really subtle way, for him to be missing throughout much of the back half of this movie, I just don't know if that's the right call. Even if what's there thematically, symbolically, I understand. I don't even know if it's ineffective. I just don't know if...
Well, it would have been effective if he was there. You're right.
It would have been more effective if he was there. I agree.
Oh, and it's something you said earlier too, right? You have a pretty good performance here from Jaime Fidel.
Yeah.
Utilize him. Use him, and the film doesn't do that. There's one thing that he is so great at in this movie. It's his insert shots, his reaction shots to things that don't even require any dialogue. One of my favorite moments in the entire film. It's not quite in relation to the themes that you're talking about there around humiliation and the way that the church has a play in that. It's his funeral scene, because in real life Pinochet does die of a heart attack, and that is presented here, but it's faked. And the way he very calmly wakes up mid-funeral,
it's so good.
like it's so great. And then just his eyes say it all, as if to suggest, oh, okay, I'm at my funeral now. Okay, got to keep playing dead. But like it just proves how strong that performance is, especially comedically. That Jaime Fidel, he easily could have emphasized those themes that you're talking about if he was part of the conversation. And he absolutely should have been. Instead, he's distracted by other things that involve more about sexuality. Like, there's a lot about sexuality in this film too, which I think has a place here. I think that is certainly fair, especially as it relates to the church.
Yeah.
But it feels like it's almost disconnected because it's happening in an editing way. It's simultaneous with those financial dealings. And I think it just murkies those waters even further, like you're talking about.
I agree. When I think about this film, the best scenes, as far as I'm concerned anyway, are with Vidal on screen as Pinochet.
Yeah.
We mentioned earlier, although this is a younger version of himself, but it's the same character with Marie Antoinette. And, there's the faking of his death, as you mentioned earlier. Or there's a moment later on in the film when he's talking to Carmen and he's naively falling in love with her. And you see him like he's an adolescent schoolboy. And then later on, when the truth is revealed between the two of them, like his reaction to that is, again, as it's like adolescent jealousy, the way that he reacts to...
I just can't help but laugh that you said adolescent schoolboy, knowing where there's something that happens in this film.
Yeah, I use those words very purposefully. It's very funny because, again, or even, I mentioned earlier when he's talking very brazenly about the carnage that he's caused. He talks about it like he's a teenage school bully who is proud of his bullying.
Yeah.
Like everything he does, it is Lorraine is doing a great job of bringing humiliation to the character by rendering him as this loathing vampire who wants to die. And, so he has this, I don't, he has this ignorance to him, this arrogance to him.
It's an immaturity, really.
That's immature.
The fact that he's 250
yes.
years old, Lorraine does a great job distinguishing age versus growing up.
Exactly.
And
he's a child.
He's a child, which is why, without getting too much into it, I will say I think the ending of this movie is kind of perfect.
It's so good.
I really like that, and I think that ending, especially, not just given the aesthetic changes that the film goes through, but tonally, it kind of straddles this line between biting humor and sincerity, which is always a hard balance to really succeed in. And I think the film does a pretty good job with that. Again, I just wish it maneuvered the waters more consistently and smoothly to get to that point. But I still think it mostly works because of the Pinochet of it all, still being center
agree,
street.
because it's centering on this character that the film at its core wants to humiliate the most.
Yeah.
And it does a great job of doing that by making him this immature child of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's what makes the themes and the commentary at the end of the film so provocative in many regards, because what it suggests is that these atrocities, this evil, is cyclical. It doesn't end.
Yeah.
It will go on and on and on. So the film, by the time the end credits roll, it is extremely cynical and bitter.
Yeah.
And that righteous anger, I think, is extremely felt because of how it treats its central figure throughout. I just wish he wasn't taken out of the movie in the middle.
Oh, he becomes a supporting character in his own movie at one point, and his 5 children become way more important than I think they even should be. I do think cleverly, they're I was looking at their character names on IMDb. I don't think they're the right names of Pinochet's actual children, if they are documented. So, but I think it gets into some of the dealings that some of these identities needed to be blurred in some way, just given the financial dealings at play. So I don't know if that was a deliberate choice or not, but I did notice that. But even so, like, most of these children are, this is not a knock. It's just the way that they're incorporated into the story. They're non-characters in many ways.
We don't learn anything about them other than their jealousy and greed.
They're talking MacGuffins is basically what they are.
Yeah.
So to incorporate them so much into the story by the back half, it's very distracting, because all I wanted was more of Pinochet.
I agree. And again, as much as the ideas on humiliation, its ideas on the church and the state, on its own terms, I understand why it's here. And I do actually find it interesting. I just wish it was in a different movie. I wish those films or those ideas came through in a different film, because I do think it bogs down, what is so great about this film as it relates to Pinochet. And it is such a significant part of the middle of this film.
Yeah.
That whole back and forth where Carmen is interviewing all of them and she's trying to find out all of this financial information, that we come to find out that the church is wanting for their own motives and their own purposes, which are very gray in and of themselves.
Yeah.
And it just, to me, I do think the film loses muster. And
that's why the film, that's why it felt
muddled.
Yeah, it is. And that's why I said in my opening thoughts, it almost felt to me like it was this short film that got stretched out into a feature length. I think there's a great hour-long film here if you incorporate on only the Pinochet of it all.
Yeah.
And still kind of, broadly paint a picture around those finances to emphasize that thematic humiliation that you're talking about. And I think that it has a place here, but I mean, what we're talking about there, the narrative around how Pinochet's finances and how his children are incorporated into that, like, that's a solid 45-minute narrative right there. It really is.
It's a big part of it. I don't know exactly what Lorraine's inspirations were creatively. However, as we're talking here, I think he should have channeled a little bit more Charlie Chaplin, because Chaplin can take an idea
Yeah.
as simple as it is and extend it into a feature-length film. Now, this isn't, it's spiritually, it's very different than a Chaplin film. However, what is so great about Chaplin, because especially his silent movies, is that we're able to be entranced by a character that isn't speaking. It's all done through visual gags. Half of this film, maybe not quite half, but the best elements of it are exactly that, where Pinochet isn't really saying much. In fact, when he's on screen, it's mostly the narration we hear. We don't hear him verbally a whole lot.
Yeah.
It is the performance that is driving that humor. As I noted in my opening thoughts, it is the dry visual commentary that makes the levity what it is. It's the eye opening, it's the licking of the blade, it's the taking the head out of the jar. He's not saying things in those moments. He's just doing things, and the camera captures it. How is that different than Charlie Chaplin in a silent film? It's not.
It's not.
And Charlie Chaplin, and not just Chaplin, but many directors have demonstrated over the years, you can make a feature out of that.
You can.
And I feel like maybe Larraín should have really delved into that more directly, because if this was just 90 minutes, let's say his children are out of this altogether. It's just 90 minutes of him walking around and loathing.
Flying around Santiago. And
flying around.
Eating hearts and killing people. And
and just looking all lonesome. And he's bitter about living for 250 years. And maybe there's a line or two about how he just simply wants to die. And
the first act sets it up that way, because the whole first act is that vibe, right?
Exactly.
From a speaking standpoint, the dialogue is solely from the perspective of the narrator.
Yeah.
That's occasionally some backing dialogue here and there, but it is primarily the voiceover.
I agree. And I still think there's ways to offer up that childish, vibe and spirit without it having to come through his finances or his kids.
Yeah.
Or maybe you bring up the finances in a different way, but where he's on screen for 90 minutes primarily.
Mm-hmm.
And so you channel that and the levity, and you undermine him when he's on screen.
Yeah.
That's what I feel like Larraín should have done. But again, that's not what we get. So I don't want to necessarily criticize him for what I think is best, but I do think that involving his children the way he does, it does make for an uneven experience.
Well, yeah, and I'm with you. I don't want to criticize the movie for something that it's not, but at the same time, I also feel like that opening act sets up a movie that doesn't deliver. It feels
it becomes something else entirely. Almost.
I feel like because the film does have this propulsion and this comedic vibe that you're talking about, and if it were extended for a full 90 minutes, that would be a much more interesting movie, in my opinion. But I do think it is fair to criticize it in that way, because I do think the opening act is promising that, and then it doesn't deliver on that promise.
I agree. I very much do agree. I will say, though, as much as I do criticize the film for that, and maybe I'm being a little hard on the film, because I think this could have been really great. Yeah. And I really did enjoy myself when the film was operating at its highest levels, with Vidal's performance, the cinematography, as we noted earlier, the droll qualities of this film, especially
the kills. You can't forget the kills.
It's violent.
It is a bloody movie.
And some of its best humor comes through in the violence. And some of the
weirdly worked for me.
Yeah, I mean, I loved this film when it was operating in those ways. It really is just that middle section and how it becomes an interrogation on finances that just become a little banal, despite the cinematography. The cinematography is still great, but it becomes too much about plot. And
I agree.
Too much story? It should have been more characterization and less story, I guess.
I think if you're gonna make a movie that is all about pastiche and metaphor, then just Just
do that.
just stick with it.
Yeah.
Just stick with it.
I agree.
Yeah,
I agree.
and sadly, yeah, this one tries to do both, and the seams are showing here.
I agree. As a satire, though, I still laughed a lot. I still enjoyed myself on the whole.
Yeah,
But
yeah. I mean, I'm definitely not negative on this movie. I'm more mixed
Yeah.
to positive than anything else. It's
yes,
easily sitting in that 3 out of 5 star range on Letterboxd for me. Which is to say, of all the films I've seen from Pablo Larraín, this is probably my least favorite. But it's one that I say that with a sense of disappointment because it's the one I feel like I could have loved a lot more if it was as tight as it could have been. Like this one had the most promise for me. There's so much about it, especially in that first third where I thought, "Oh, this is my jam. This is my jam," and then it wasn't my jam.
No, that's very fair. I mean, I still much prefer Jackie and Emma and Spencer to this. I do like this more than Neruda.
Okay, I haven't
Neruda,
seen
though,
that yet.
is in a lot of ways the two films, while very different in terms of approach, ultimately I have the same issues in the sense that very good performances. Neruda is really well shot. The craftsmanship is there. The
Sure.
story is just uneven for me. Ultimately, the same experience despite the approaches. However, there's something about the exquisite cinematography to this film and the performances here and just how much I really do love it as a satire when it's at its best. I definitely prefer over Neruda
Okay.
at this point, but it's a little bit of a step down from Spencer and Jackie and Emma.
Yeah, I'll say this: I'll be rewatching the first third as a great short film from this year. I think up until the kids showing up at his isolated location, like there's granted it's a much thinner movie, but there's an end point. Like it feels like you could take that out and actually offer it as like a 30 to 40-minute short film, and I think it's a bit more effective in that way.
I agree. Or if you want to include some of the rest of the film, you can maybe include the scene where we're introduced to Carmen and then just give us that third act, because that final 20-25 minutes is impeccable. It is really great. That final reveal, we can't give it away, but
if we did give it away, those listening who haven't seen the film will think we're probably lying.
They wouldn't believe it. That's a great point. They wouldn't believe it.
Yeah.
It is astonishing. I just love it so much. It's so great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. I love that final shot. Again, even with how cynical it becomes thematically there at the end.
Did you feel it was fully cynical? Like, because at times I thought there was maybe even a slight sense of hope to it.
Oh, no. No, I felt it fully cynical. Because, again, what it suggests is how cyclical the violence and carnage is. That it won't die. It doesn't want to die. It might give the facade that there's hope or the facade that it will die.
Okay.
But it doesn't.
Maybe that's what I'm latching onto is that facade, because I was latching onto this idea that age versus growing up. And we see Pinochet as this heavily aged figure that hadn't quite grown up yet. Is this now the chance for him to grow up in the right way? Or will he be raised to maintain that cyclical, violent nature that he is known for?
Okay. I think what you're saying is interesting, and I could buy that if the figure we see at the end was anyone different than who it is.
Okay.
But when you look at that figure and let's say their own reputation, which isn't also very good either, it's hard for me to buy that sense of hope.
I think that's fair. I at the same time, I think it's fun pondering on the potential what if by the ending, and I'm not sure if the film is asking us to do that, but if it is, I think it is fun. It's at least fascinating to do that. And I was thinking to myself the what if of it all, if there even was one to really ponder on.
Yeah, I mean, I think given the context of who this is about and who that reveal is, these are figures that are reviled.
Fair.
People hate and loathe these figures, as they should. As they should.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that Lorraine wants to emphasize, given how, given the age of them as vampires, and as we noted earlier, that Pinochet, he wants to die. I've had enough. It's been 250 years.
Yeah.
But at the end of it, I guess without getting into too many spoilers here, to me, it presents this idea that it just won't die. As much as we want it to, it's not going to go away.
Yeah, I think, and given Lorraine's history as a filmmaker and how he chooses to depict certain political issues, that's more likely his intent here.
Yeah, and
it's definitely more consistent with his overall ethos.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And look, I don't say that as a bad thing. Like the cynical nature of to me, there's a potency there. Like I found it all effective because of the central performance, and again, the film operating at its best when it's emphasizing Pinochet.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you add in this reveal and what they represent, and it just makes it all the more mesmerizing. So,
yeah,
I do love it. So, anyway, that is to say, again, the opening as a short film, yes, I would maybe introduce Carmen when it comes into the fold, and then
introduce what pieces you need to at least make a movie out of that, and it makes
just
sense.
Pick out the kids and all the interrogation.
Oh yeah, who needs kids these days?
Exactly. Well, and that's funny because that's essentially what Pinochet says at the end. He
That's
doesn't
true.
say those words exactly.
He's actually
but that's
commenting on the
ultimately what he
futility of the kids in this movie.
says.
I
Yeah.
wonder if that's part of the joke. I wonder if we're criticizing nothing.
Maybe that is the point.
Yeah.
I don't
Okay,
know.
if that is the point, Pablo Larraín, you got us. You got us, man.
For sure. All right. Any other final thoughts on El Conde?
I will say I am tempted to give this one another shot because there are so many things about it I admire, at least aesthetically speaking. It will go down as one of the best looking movies of the year.
No doubt about it.
I wish I could see it on the big screen. It's a shame that it was just dumped on Netflix.
I know.
But yeah, it's a beautiful looking movie. Edward Lockman, once again, calling him out. Beautiful work here from a cinematography standpoint. It's really great.
Yeah, I do love the cinematography here. I will echo you. The flying sequences are really fantastic. Love how the music complements them throughout the film as well. Especially that ballet sequence that we get halfway through. It's just exquisite stuff.
Yeah.
Absolutely love the film.
Tonally, it's so out of left field because it's almost heavenly.
Yeah.
It's wow, this is quite beautiful. I'm kind of moved by this. Am I supposed to be?
Yeah.
I was confused by it, but in the right ways that made me fascinated by it.
Well, and you think about that symbolically because I think there's an argument to be made that what we see there is from Pinochet's perspective, and that how he feels about the church is like, again, that's where Lorraine is murking the waters as far as the church's involvement in all of this. But I think, again, you can also counteract that with, well, he's a child. What does he know? He's a dumb idiot. He is very obtuse in this film.
He is an unreliable narrator.
Absolutely.
Even though he's not really the narrator. Although the actual narrator
no,
also a bit unreliable.
But, it's an interesting sequence that actually has layers to it. And it's not just a wondrous image visually.
Sure.
But even emotionally, thematically, there's some really great stuff going on there. So I still think this is a good movie. Lorraine operating in a unique and different way that we just haven't seen before. And I did not expect the film to be like this.
Yeah.
And, because the other thing, too, I want to emphasize is Lorraine and Guillermo Calderon's writing, because the dialogue isn't my favorite part of the movie.
Yeah,
particularly the interrogation. However, when it's Pinochet and another character, I do find that often very interesting.
Agreed.
Because, again, the way the film humiliates him in a way, because of the way it introduces irony, I just think is wondrous. And it's just funny. It's darkly very entertaining.
Yeah,
and
I'm with you.
I love that. Love the dry sensibilities here. So, It's on Netflix. Go and watch it. If it's somehow in a theater near you, I would run as fast as possible.
I envy you.
and get to it. So, but yeah, we would love to hear from you. If you agree or disagree with anything that we had to say here, you can email us insessionfilm@gmail.com. You can hit us up on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Blue Sky, whatever the case. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment below.
Absolutely.
Be sure to subscribe to the channel, subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, however you listen to the show. We really do appreciate it. Brennan, anything else before we get out of here?
Do you want to stick with El Brende and LJDA?
El Brende.
I think we're going to do that for the rest of the year. How about that?
How
about not?
But I will say this, though. I did enjoy this conversation. Our 2001 retrospective is coming out, so stay tuned for that.
It's important.
It's going to be a lot of fun. Episode 552, we talked about our favorite performances of 2001. Really great time. Go and check that out. With that, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh, man. The Marie Antoinette thing had me in stitches.
Man, imagine if it was Kirsten Dunst.